I'll get started because I know some people might just be joining, but we do have a pretty good group here already. And I know we've got lots to chat about. So I will introduce myself, and I'm going to introduce Nucco Brain, and then I'll pass it off to our panelists and our moderators. My name's Hillary, and I'm the marketing strategist here at Nucco Brain. And welcome to our event about corporate comms in uncertainty. So a little bit about Nucco Brain. We are a corporate content creation studio. So we make the content that helps our brands advertise online and market themselves. So that content falls into 4 buckets. So corporate comms is usually a longer campaign that we'll run. Branded content is a one-off piece. Learning and development are digital learning experiences that we can create. And experiential and interactive is essentially everything else. So VR experience or an interactive piece of content. And we will be talking about a couple examples of the work that we have built that fall into some of these buckets as well. Here's a few of the clients that we do work for, and we'll be explaining some of the work for some of these clients. For engaging with us during the event and after, you can find us at Nucco Brain. And if you have any questions and you want to tweet at us, we'll make sure that they get answered. You can use these 2 hashtags, or if you do share anything on LinkedIn as well, please tag us so that we can keep the conversation going. All right, so I'm going to pass it off to Mark now, who's one of our business directors, and he's going to introduce the event.
Fantastic, and bear with me if my connection is somewhat iffy. It's been a bit iffy all day, so fingers crossed for this, it works. I may turn my video off if I am sort of jittery a bit, so just let me know if that's happening, and I'll be happy to do that. So as Hillary said, we're here today to talk about sort of corporate communications in the age of uncertainty. And obviously, as everybody knows, we're currently facing one of the biggest challenges in our lifetimes, or at least in my lifetime, with COVID. It's a disruptive force that's affecting pretty much everyone on the planet. It means we can't be in the office together, we can't meet with our clients in person at least, and a lot of types of content, photography, live action, experiential, for the moment have been shelved. So marketers across the globe are having to think of alternative approaches to connecting with their audiences, and they're having to do it quite quickly as well. So we're all having to think of new ways to do things, talk about things, create things. At Nucco, we've created a series of content that speaks specifically to the issue in our best efforts to respond to the current crisis and the new ways of working. And if you're interested in any of those links to any of our articles, please feel free to ask after the event. But COVID isn't the only thing that we've had to respond and react to over the last few years and decades. There's been changes in regulations like GDPR or MiFID II back in 2018. We've had disruptive political circumstances like Brexit to deal with. We had 9/11, we had the global crash of 2008. So the point is, sometimes circumstances change, and in many instances, these changes happen really fast. Now, at Nucco Brain, we've worked on a number of reactive projects at the minute. Our most recent project is for UKRI, where we've helped them highlight key scientific research on COVID-19. For Deloitte, we helped them uncover some of the key aspects of VAT when that was being introduced to the GCC back in 2018. Back in 2016, when the pension schemes were changing, we worked with the John Lewis Partnership to help them explain what this meant for their workforce of over 100,000 employees. We also worked with Rolls-Royce Engineering to help them define best practice for social media etiquette when the use of social media by employees was becoming more prevalent. And when GDPR was happening, we also created our own infographic to help our clients and partners navigate all the specifics of this very, very complex thing that I don't think we've quite figured out yet, even to this day. So how can marketers prepare to react in uncertain times? How do you connect with an audience with a new or revised message in a responsive and sensitive manner? Well, that's what we're here to discuss with our panel today. Unfortunately, we're one short due to some unforeseen circumstances, but we have 2 great panelists speaking. First off, we have a returning guest in Geraghty from Culture Consultancy. And joining her is our MD at Nucco Brain, Stefano Marrone. I'll let them introduce themselves and then we can jump into discussion. So Joe, do you want to kick off and just introduce a little bit about yourself and tell us about your experience with this kind of thing? And then we'll move on to Stefano.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Mark. So I'm Jo Geraghty. I'm Director of Culture Consultancy, and for the most part we run large-scale culture change programs. We design employee value propositions and deal with leadership development, and a lot of that is is around really big sort of inflection points. So mergers and acquisitions, restructuring, big regulatory changes, that type of thing. So where there's a big shift in the organisation, and you need to get your people on board with that. And my background is 15 years for American investment banks. So a lot of that was spent kind of in HR and internal comms, and really on the firefighting side of things, which I might tell you a bit more about later. But that kind of, you know, disaster recovery, you know, sudden events, how do you deal with that, and how do you engage people in what needs to be done?
Cool. Thanks, Joe. Gonna introduce myself. Hi, Stefano. Mark talked a little bit about Nucco already, so I'm not gonna spend more time on that. But I founded the company around.
Stefano?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Okay.
I think it's a bit frozen. But
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So as I was saying, like, I found a Nucco Brain, and I've been involved as a creative lead and on the strategy for most of our clients. You know, our main job is to explain complexity with engaging content. So we're going to present some of the different solutions that we found given the specific topic. My background personally started in Leo Burnett in now what looks like ages ago, working for B2C clients, and then I moved into the entertainment and startup and innovation space later on, and that led to, you know, what is the creation of Nucco Brain. But I think that we, you know, our journey is from a classic creative entity to something that is more of a B2B and strategic approach towards communication and content creation. So I hope that I can give you some insights today.
Great, thanks guys. So to kick things off, you know, we've got, as I mentioned before, we've got Brexit and COVID-19 as glaring examples of big change that affects businesses and their communications. But we know there are more, as I mentioned before. Can you tell us a bit more about what other regulations affecting your business or the business of your clients? What other types of changes do you need to be preparing for? Joe, do you want to kick that one off?
Yeah, definitely, Marco. I think, I mean, you know, you mentioned Brexit. I think it can't be underestimated how much work there still is to do on Brexit. It's still not certain exactly what the future holds. So I think businesses are really grappling with, you know, it's not easy to set clear direction on certain things because we don't know what that's going to look like. So I think that's a huge one. If you're in financial services, then senior manager regime came out at the end of last year, which again, I think, you know, people had started to implement that at the beginning of this year, and then I think COVID overtook. And so getting their heads around what SMR really means and how their people change their behaviour in accordance to that is still underway. And then obviously we just saw IR35 on the contractor piece being kicked down the road by the government for now. So that's still to come at some point this year. So I think the big thing from our side really though is that we've been preparing leaders and managers for this type of scenario, or these types of scenarios and this type of incident for quite a while. We have a next generation leader program, which I think now is just a now generation leader program, but it's really that preparing them for the VUCA world, which, you know, to some extent people dismiss, but that volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous is exactly what we're living in now. So trying to gear people up with the skills and expertise that they need to deal with these types of scenarios just popping up all the time without warning, you know, kind of how do you cope with resilience and adapt, you know, how are you more adaptable? How do you manage your business today? You know, keep the wheels running, but be horizon scanning for trends coming up in the future. And then there's a piece in there about really exceptional communication. And I think that's sort of played out now where people have had to suddenly remote work overnight. And I think those people with excellent communication skills have won the day because their teams are mobilized and ready and off, you know, assuming they've got the tech to back that up, I guess. But in those circumstances, those people are really kind of, you know, up and running in no time. Whereas where we're seeing clients with issues is where they weren't ready for it. And that communication has just fallen down and, you know, causes issues as it goes along.
Stefano, do you have any thoughts? So Mark's Zoom has died, so I'm going to take it. I'm going to take it from here, which is fine. So
Joys of modern living.
Exactly. We're reacting. Go ahead, Stefano.
So yeah, I think that Joe touched on many other of the things that we're seeing as it happens. But one thing that I would like to comment on is the fact that comms are more important than ever. Meaning, I was just over the phone with a CEO of a big fast consumer good group just before the meeting started, and he was telling me that they reacted very quickly from a technical point of view by giving everybody a phone and a laptop, and they did it immediately. And but that the biggest challenge was actually how to make sure that they preserve their culture and they communicate in the right way with the workforce that can have now a lot of different circumstances. So I think that there is an element of taking into account the fact that the environments change and that from a distance you cannot control them. I mean, this is specifically to COVID, but I think that if we think about times of crisis in general, having them be prepared in a comms way, the tricky bit, Joe was mentioning the fact that there is this fluid element, is that with your comms, you can, and you have to be honest and to be candid, but at the same time, you don't want to sound schizophrenic as a brand, and when you're communicating. So I think a really good thing towards what your comms in terms of emergency are and how they're different from your standardized way of doing comms, I think is the stuff that is the first step that every brand and every comms expert should take into being able to tackle situations like this, especially because when an emergency comes, you never really can say when it is coming. And I think that with Brexit, we felt that we had time and people were making scenario planning, but at the same time, anything like market crashes or COVID, it's already too late when you have to deal with it and think about what do we do in a case of emergency. So having protocols before is an essential aspect.
I think that's a great segue into our next question, which is how can a brand best prepare for themselves for when a crisis hits? Because obviously when it hits, you have to be ready to just kind of hit the ground running. How can they best prepare before the crisis hits? And how can a company or brand set guiding principles for effective crisis comms?
You want to go, Joe?
Yeah, don't mind. I mean, I think some of it you touched on there, Stefano, but there is that piece about really being prepared. And I know it sounds obvious, but very few people really are, or very few companies really are. So what does it mean? What are the principles that you would have in place? What are the design principles that you think, okay, we need to be on brand, we need to, our messaging needs to be consistent, but how are we going to do this? What does it really look like? And from an employee perspective, it's important to remember that comms in crisis is more than just imparting information. It's not kind of, there's a fire, get out of the building kind of thing. It's you need to mobilize your people. So part of that getting tech, as you said, the part of the COVID thing that's just happened about getting phones and laptops to people is because you care about productivity and performance. You need to mobilize your people. So one element is about mobilizing them. So how do you do that through your messaging? And the other piece is around their well-being. The human element. You have to care about how they are going to receive the message, what it's going to mean to them, how they're going to react to it. So I think those two things are really kind of key in my mind to prepare ahead of a crisis. I mean, we don't know what the crisis is going to be, but I mean, at least factoring those things in ahead of time, I think is crucial.
Yeah, I think that I'm gonna take a little bit more of a technical point of view because you're great at covering the cultural aspect of that, Joe. To be able to react that quickly, I think that what you have to have is on one side your principles and your values aligned. And that's all the things that Joe works towards. But from from a design and communication, purely technically speaking. I think that what we see is that in the moment where there is a crisis, communication is the moment where all the things that normally don't happen in stakeholder alignment suddenly kind of crumble down. So what you have is that you have moments in which decisions need to be taken relatively quickly, and they need to have the opportunity to be presented, and decision need to be made fast. And instead, precisely because it's a crisis, there is an element of panic, there is an element of freezing, not want to take the wrong decisions. Is that a communication that normally will take, let's say, 3 or 4 stakeholders with brand we're working with, suddenly involves a number or a bigger number of stakeholders. So we call that, and we have a little bit of a protocol inside of Nucco Brain with our clients when there are a situation like this. We call it wartime design, and it's like, how do we make sure that we can create content that really works in a way that can be created quickly? And I think that there are some considerations where more time will be spent thinking about the messaging and to get that message and nail it, which means that less time can be spent into the visual aspect of it and the minutia of it. So what we're trying to see and trying to support clients with is by creating toolkits of content that is very, very quick to prepare, whether that's standardized visual elements, a standardized way of doing, for example, quick videos, and to have that ready to go, so that if something needs to be produced within the hours, it can. And also if it needs to be produced by people that are not necessarily super proficient, it still can. Because at times, I think that there is this element of making sure that, or checking the availability of partners. Instead, we try to empower most of our clients with what we call, toolkits. And there is another aspect of it that I think is quite important. It's like reflection on the tone of voice, meaning I've never seen, and I think that now more than ever, it's something that we should have more, an extension of the branding guidelines that include what is that tone of voice in times of crisis, because we were just discussing this in the call in prep of this online event, and it's like what happens when there is an element or a strong element of crisis? How do you speak? Do you speak differently? And this is normally a reflection that happens in the moment of the crisis that then opens a forum for conversation. Instead, it would be great if we have the opportunity to think about that in advance.
So we
have, and even on the stakeholders, I think, the more in advance, like you say, that there's an agreement around the toolkit or those guidelines from the stakeholders, that in the moment of crisis, you don't have to go back to everybody. Somebody is empowered at that point to make a decision. Always kind of say who's the leader here. Who is the boss of this situation? Because there isn't time then to go to everybody saying, do you sign this off? Do you agree with this? Just you need to get it done.
Yeah, like you have a fire marshal, in a real situation, right? It's like that there is this one guy that is being responsible. I think that's a great approach. If you can have somebody that is, it's better to have consistency and a series of quick decisions made than being frozen as an organization as the world keeps changing. And you can see that some organizations do that. The one that have charismatic leaders, or very strong structure with a strong CEO or strong MD, but not all companies are made in that way. Not thank God, I would say, not everybody has a Steve Jobs type of situation in their organization. So how do we prepare in that case?
Yeah, and there's time for that type of leadership, right? There's time and space for it. But I think that I say, you can't coach people out of a burning building, and this is a burning building. So somebody needs to mobilize them and get them out. So
it sounds like we need to be creatively prepared, but also internally, culturally prepared as well. So now the next question kind of digs in a little deeper, similar to a fire drill. If, every once in a while we all have to practice what would happen if a fire happened. Do you think worst case scenario planning is a good tool to use here? So if something like this happens, then we do this. If this happens, then we do this for a company.
Well, I definitely do. I mean, maybe that's my personality, but I sort of train clients up to be what I call strategic optimists, because I think you can't be this sort of fluffy, oh, I hope it goes well, hope nothing bad happens type of optimist in business. I think you always have to be looking for the pitfalls. What might go wrong. I mean, your hope is that it doesn't go wrong, but what could at any point, what could happen? And if you plan like that, then you can fill the gaps, you can mitigate, you can, if there's a sudden event, then you're ready. I sometimes joke with my team that I was on the bird flu pandemic committee, and obviously, as we all know, bird flu never became a pandemic, so it sounds like a ridiculous scenario, but it was a very real scenario at the time that bird flu was a big thing. And we were ready. The team were ready. We had Tamiflu in the fridge in the office, and all sorts of other things. We had a plan, and everything was ready to go. So I think that level of kind of readiness for any eventuality is a good place to be.
And I think that there is an element where, from a business perspective, a lot of businesses, especially from a financial point of view, are definitely constantly doing these scenarios. So you talk with people on a C-level, and what you see is that they're like, oh yeah, we're doing various simulation about what happens if our income is this, if our income is this, if our income is this, or if this keeps going for XYZ number of months. What I don't see necessarily is this practiced well in comms. So scenario thinking, I think, is necessary, and it's necessary to. It doesn't matter how strongly optimistic you are, to have that sort of devil's advocate approach, because at the end of the day, that's what distinguishes, I think, responsible and reckless companies, and there is that management aspect of it. But comms wise, I think that's necessary, because things happen, and in every industry there is a slight difference, in what the worst case scenario can be. But I think that people need to be able to at least exercise that. If anything, like the aviary flu that didn't happen, but I think that forms a certain type of mindset on how to then behave, and you can from those exercises really gain a lot. I mean, it's best practices that you can get from a lot of things like think tanks and whatnot, but it's rarely applied to comms. And I think we need more of that, especially now that news keeps changing on a regular basis. So having something ready, or for example, 3 or 4 different messages pre-prepared on specific type of outcomes that can be your key message in case the pandemic keeps going, for example. Or, we know that Brexit can have more or less 3 different, macro outcomes and approaches, are Brexit, of Brexit, and so on. I think it's relatively easy and possible to prepare messaging for the 3 of them and be ready as a company, rather than wait for the outcome to come out. There is a finite number of macro scenarios with specific crises, and I think that the time utilized and spent on this cannot be considered wasted, because at the end of the day, it will have an impact no matter what.
So it's interesting. We've had 2 of our biggest examples, Brexit and COVID, have happened in the past year. So for your clients, did they already have a reactive comm strategy, or is that something that will be kind of a new suggestion that we'll be rolling out based on the events of the past year?
Do you mind if I go for this, Joe?
Yeah, you go for it.
I think that there is an element where it's almost like what you see, and I don't want to be kind of apocalyptic, but I think that it's just the effect of a global connected world, that the amount of dramatic events and different things that can change very quickly is increasing, in a sense, because of all the interdependencies in the world. If I have to be honest, I've taken a look at clients maybe 5 years ago. I don't think that there was this this attitude, especially because there is this. I think that we are in front of a very different situation where you had one dramatic thing that happened. It was like one big event, 9/11 happens, market crash happens, and then you have the following months to act and recover. And instead, if you think about now, where yes, COVID is here, but Brexit is still here, but we have still we will really need to have to become more reactive and think about this in a way that is a new normal. I don't think that the brands or comms department thought like that in the past, but they definitely have to think like this in the future.
I don't know if you see this, Stefano, but I think what I see people with is, obviously when 9/11 happened, I don't think anybody who's alive now has seen anything quite like it, right? So, that unfolded. And then there were more and more terror attacks. And so I think people were like, oh, terror attacks, that's a thing. So now we're sort of half ready for that. Mm-hmm. And I think what we've seen with, Brexit was, completely out of nowhere, and, not many people saw that coming, and there wasn't really a precedent for it. So that was new. Now you have COVID, which we haven't really seen before. Well, we haven't seen before to this extent. So I think it's getting people into the mindset of, you can't plan for what the actual event is going to be. It's more of a principle that you need to be ready with the types of comms. I mean, like you said about Brexit, yes, you can plan these 3 scenarios because we know about it. Mm-hmm. But the next other big thing that comes out of somewhere, we've got no idea what it's going to be. So just that, being in that state of readiness for what it could be, I think but it's tough to get people into that mindset. Yeah,
that alert, attitude towards things, especially because there is a lot of time that goes into planning and precise planning, and I think that embracing that aspect, I think that there is a lot of talk about this. If you think about how we went from tech, from a waterfall to an agile development, and it seems to be working in certain areas and not be valid in others. But I find it like we've been forced to work like that in tech because things change immediately and so quickly. We went from doing something online some years ago where you just had to make sure that it worked on a couple of different devices. Now, when we do quality assurance for Apple, for our clients, we end up doing at least 15 devices checks. And that was a market imperative. So it is possible. And I think that some aspects of business already do that. So I don't think there is a technical impossibility. I think it's a mindset shift, and the fact that there is this prediction of comms to be these like perfect things, and I think that those brands that instead are winning are the ones that are embracing this word. I mean, from a purely marketing perspective, you're seeing that the ones that are taking either a supportive of light-hearted approach now during COVID, and actually either addressing it or talking around it are the ones that are gaining, maybe new customers or retaining their customers. And instead, on the other side, we were just discussing about how bad was right after the outbreak to be sold something, and that's like because we have a plan, we have to keep going with the plan. I think that there is this sort of affectionate approach towards the content that or the strategy that has been created.
Yeah, it's a kind of, it's empathy. I think it's that sort of empathy with the person that's receiving the communications. Do you really think this person is going to want to be sold to right now or communicated with in this way? And I think that's key, kind of putting the receiver of the comms back in the center.
We had said yesterday there's kind of no such thing as steady state anymore. Being like the steady state now is being ready to react. So that's kind of an interesting place to be now looking forward.
Yeah, and there's no back to normal, right? Or at least not for a very long time. So, I love that people think that way, but I think it's
like it's changed things fundamentally. Yeah,
there's just change.
Exactly. There's just change. Looking forward.
Just change.
Lucky us. Yeah. So the next question is about content. So how can content kind of save the day, let's say, when we're in one of these situations, and how can social media be used as a tool?
Stefano, you go first on that.
Yeah. All right.
Probably better for yeah.
I think that there is a strong element here where, like a lot of every brand, and by brand I don't mean necessarily B2C brand, but every type of brand or company at the moment has to embrace this idea that every time you put something out there, you're a publisher. You're effectively acting as a publisher. So it's not just promotional, but people would resonate with you according to the content that you put out. And what I've seen is that successful comms campaigns are the one where there is an element of actual usefulness in the messaging that is put out there. So if the content is actually useful, or an element of I would say entertainment or levity. At the end of the day, people consume content for just two reasons. Either it's useful or it's entertaining. If you can be both, that's fantastic. But I think that if whatever you think about putting out now doesn't fit within any of these two categories or both, then it's worth really pausing and thinking, is it even worth considering pushing content out? On the other end, though, what we're seeing is that people that are leveraging that reactive aspect of creating content are really seeing great results. I mean, what we're seeing at the moment is that it's a little bit more forgiving. I think that quick reactions can be forgiving in terms of the quality that is expected on the polish of the content itself, and that's something that has been awarded. Meaning, some people are waiting until it's perfect, but then you lose that type of momentum, and instead a timely reaction, even if it is not that amazing polished video that you would do during your above the line campaign. I think that people sort of forget sometimes how transient the nature of what we do is. In this sense, I think that Gen Z and native digital already know it. Like they know that when they do a post, they put a lot of effort into it, but then when they do a story, they produce a lot of different things. And I think that a lot of brands are they're not having this different standard in mind. They're treating everything with the same sort of quality filter. And the truth is that there is no reason, necessarily to do that. So I think that, that element of usefulness or entertainment is the criteria. And that if in this moment you're not gonna be either or, maybe you should really think hard about almost like your values proposition to your customer.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, I think about this when we think about the content for change programs. There's a few things. So we have a sort of underlying philosophy, which is educate, engage, and enable. Is that what these comms are doing? Am I learning from this about what I need to do? Am I enabled to actually be able to do it? Am I given the tools to actually do it? And is this content engaging me, or is this just flying over my head, basically?
Yeah.
And then the other piece is how the sort of frequency or cadence that you're delivering it. Because again, if you're bombarding people with content, even if it's very good quality, if you're kind of ramming that down people's throats, it just doesn't land well. And especially if they're in a state of stress, trying to absorb that much information, even if it's really useful and really good content, is quite hard. So just a few things to think about and kind of practicalities, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Leading on from that, thinking about, so you're creating content, but how do you make sure that your brand stands out when everyone's creating content? Because I don't know if it's just me, but everything kind of on my LinkedIn is about COVID, and that's all anyone's talking about. So what are some strategies that you can use as a brand to create content that adds value and that stands out from just kind of being another piece of content about the crisis?
Mm-hmm.
We go first too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that there is an element here where I'm gonna a little bit repeat myself, but the aspect of what makes you different as a brand when you're thinking about your tone of voice. It's what should be important in the type of communication that you put out. Because I remember somebody, I think it was Seth Godin, that sent this thing as like, I don't want to be reassured by the company that I bought stocks from 7 years ago that everything is fine, during COVID. That's not gonna help anyone. And I think that there is an element there where joining a conversation should really be made in like you have a customer journey, or when are you engaging, or when were you engaging with your audience, and there's no reason for you as a brand to change that perfect moment that you built. Maybe there is a different way to engage with them, and now everything needs to be digital, for example, and instead of in person, and that's why we're doing this event like this. But the relevance and the type of conversation that you were having shouldn't change radically because of the situation. So I think that there is an element of almost losing your identity to be part of the chat, and if you have nothing to add or nothing to say, you can just acknowledge it and keep going with what makes you particular and unique as a brand. And it can be as little as keeping to your specific tone. And we were discussing actually about some brands that are talking around COVID rather than on COVID, so that they're still being true to their values. But at the same time, I would just cautious, I guess, say something for the sake of saying something, especially because what you risk is to have a backlash in that sense, and where the sock example is just a simple, more innocuous one, and then as we've seen, there are things that are way worse, we haven't touched on that, but I think that there is an element of consistency internally and externally in these moments, where you have to make sure that whatever you put out there versus what you're telling to your people resonates and is quite on the same level. You don't want to find out decisions that have been made about your future on the Twitter account of your company, for example. So I think that look inside first and then make sure that comes outside with an element of consistency is quite important.
Yeah, and I think on the, I've said it before, but I think that element of the sort of the human, keeping the empathy in there, because communicating something that is just not relevant or not going to hit, land on the spot at all is just the worst thing you can do when people are like, well, have you got any idea what I'm going through right now that you're going to try and sell me this thing that I don't need? Just doesn't work. But I think, like you said, where it has worked well, and I think where the people are sort of talking around the issue, but slightly being a little bit bolder, and just having a little bit more heart, if you like. So kind of showing that more humanness, but being a little bit bolder, I think has really worked. I always think sort of about relative experience. So if you're relatively a little bit kind of punchier in what you're doing on those two things, as long as you don't miss the mark, the danger is you go bold and you kind of overshoot and completely miss it. So I think it's a fine balance to get between kind of punching your message, but at the same time keeping that human is this relatable? Does it stick?
And just to go back to the specifics of your question, though, Hilary, I think that there is an element of what can you make to differentiate yourself is like look inside your own company and find if there is something that is of value outside. So with UKRI, the first thing that we did when we were doing the communication about COVID was, what do they have in abundance? It's a great deal of relationship with PhD and researchers. So they rightfully so thought that it would be the best thing to put us in a virtual room together with them and say, this is what at the moment we have as a value to offer. So I think that that's the element where it works incredibly well. You have UKRI on one side that gives scientific accurate information in a world where bullshit flies and rumors are all over the place. And then you have places like, as I've been discussing yesterday with you, that basically are just turning their membership to, let's say, a gym or or a members club into something tangible that they're sending you, whether that's some tips for exercising or the wine that you cannot drink at a specific place. So I think that there is this element of what do I have inside of the company that can be an added value, and I'm sure that because companies are so different, that element of USP and of difference, if you look inside, will come out.
Yeah. It's funny, I gave a talk on employee experience at the beginning of the year before this really hit, and I was talking about how, from a customer experience perspective, 81% of brands were gonna compete on customer experience, this year, and I think that it's never been starker, right? But it's probably an even higher percentage and it is even harder to do because nobody's going to walk into your store and smell the coffee and whatever. It's really, you've got to get that across. And my point at the talk was that, as Simon Sinek says, a customer won't love your brand until your employees love it first. So creating that employee experience to mirror it, I think has got to be the focus for brands this year.
Yeah, definitely. Such an opportunity to be creative and test how well you know your product, I guess, to figure out what that value is that you're really bringing. I think I'd like to go back. So Joe, you mentioned something about not missing the mark. So what happens if, you react really quickly and you send something out, but it does miss the mark? How do you kind of get back on track and fix it, but then still kind of improve that customer relationship and work on that customer relationship?
I think there's a few things. So I think the fact that you missed it in the first place is possibly because you didn't listen. So I think there's a piece about definitely what is it that people were actually after? Why did it miss the mark? So if you haven't gone about and figured that out, then you need to go and do it. And then once you've made that error, I think it's really about being very honest and open and humble in terms of saying, okay, we clearly missed the mark here, rather than trying to fudge it up. And then correcting it, and hopefully correcting it in a way that second time wins, that you're not kind of 4 or 5 iterations in, but the next time you do that you do hit the mark, but you kind of say, okay, hands up, we did it. And I think people respond, on the whole, people respond pretty well to that. Whereas if you keep just kind of fudging it and sort of trying to repair it, but not really hitting the mark, you're just digging yourself into a deeper hole, I think.
I think that it's a fantastically good question, because at the moment you can see that the brands that are behaving with all the elements of toxic masculinity are actually the ones that are missing the mark. Meaning, if you're not willing to be able to say, I got this wrong, if you're not willing to be able to go back and say, okay, I've not been. Everybody wants to be honest, but I think it's nice to use being candid. People being clear about what they got wrong. That's the stuff that doesn't work, not being willing to say that you got something wrong. I think that owning that mistake in evaluation, especially because the world is changing so fast, I think that nobody can hold you accountable for changing a tactic in a completely different world situation. However, I think that there is a certain nuance in messages between promises versus commitments. I think that this is not necessarily a time in which people can make definite promises about specific outcomes, because the world is in flux. What you can do is make a commitment towards a certain approach to something and do your best towards that. And I think that's if I had an honest. Let's say that I'm on the phone with a service, that is not working. I would much rather get from them that is we're really sorry, we're trying to do our best. If not, we will call you back within 3 days, rather than being put on hold for 45 minutes and then suddenly the line drops, little things that feel that the brand is not willing to own their, let's say, lack of IT support for the moment, because you can just put something on hold. There are very few things that are so essential that cannot wait, and those are being taken care of. I think that in a moment like this, there is also more leniency from either customers or audiences if you're being honest about it.
Yeah. I think it's the only promise or commitment you can make, I think, is to say that you're doing your best. So sometimes on these big programs, or even now with so many people being furloughed, and they're saying, well, that's it, that's the number of people that we're going to furlough for now, or that's how it's going to work. And I can't see how in this environment where things are changing literally by the hour that you can say that. I think you just have to say, this is it as far as we know for now. And that's a better message, and I think people respect that when they know there's so much going on.
Mm-hmm.
The honesty piece, very important. All right, so I'm going to open it up for questions now. So if any of the attendees have any questions, there should be a Q&A box that you can type them in, and we'll make sure they get answered. I do have a couple to get us started while others are submitted. When do you start communicating business as usual after creating reactive content?
So when do you go back to normal? Is that...
Yeah, I mean, we've said there isn't going to be a normal, so that, but yeah, kind of when do you start mixing?
No normal.
Exactly. Mixing in some of your other content after you've kind of reacted.
I think that's a good question because, in a sense, reactive content is something that you should always have there, but very much like branded content as the type of, 3 macro categories about what is a big piece that you publish every now and then something that you publish every week, and then something that you publish in a more recurrent way. I think that what you need to know is that some stuff can be put on hold, but at the same time, there's no reason to stop some of the regularity of what you do. And, it's like a special issue of a newspaper. They come out every day, or they come out every week, or a magazine, but then when there is something specific, that the magazine exists. So I think that there is an element of like a fear of this is not the normal communication, and instead we should own that even when bombs are falling over our head, metaphorically, you can still keep doing things that are perceived as normal. It's not that you have to freeze everything. So I think that the only thing is like to do an assessment towards what can be unsavory, in a sense, but it's not that people have stopped consuming or caring about things, especially because, specifically now, there is to a degree, a lot of free time. But when there is an emergency, I think that the only criteria should be some sort of scorecard towards, is this at the moment even remotely relevant? And if the answer is no, that should be the only, kind of way to distinguish.
Yeah, I think there's a real business imperative. Actually, it's quite interesting because this week now I've seen clients pick up their pretty much their business as usual again. And it's not to say that COVID's gone away, because clearly it hasn't, but they dealt with the emergency situation that they had to deal with. The people, the furloughing, the kind of, what do we do with our operations? Do we need to close? Do we need to do this? So that kind of, getting everybody up and running, remote working, kind of took whatever the last 4 weeks or whatever it's been. Whereas this week, I really see people coming back going, right, so what were those other things that I was supposed to be doing? So I guess there's an element of kind of business, drive. So it's not that they intentionally stopped. I mean, they were telling me that some kind of, capital expenditure projects are just being canned because they're not the right thing to do now this year. But for the most part, they're just going to carry on with their business as usual, with this other thing as a side project or a new way of working, or the new normal, whatever you want to call it. So I think that's true, and I think so that the business will probably kind of dictate when you pick those things back up again and when they are relevant and you need people to get into it. But yeah, just as an aside, I've definitely seen this week a real shift on that. So.
And I guess number of weeks, like there won't be a clear solution for that, but it's just in reaction to whatever's kind of going on at the time. No clear formula.
Well, I guess that the funny thing about it, I keep thinking about the keep calm and carry on poster, like during this thing where it was actually never used during World War II, but it was made during World War II as a support exactly when people had bombs falling on their head. Because the truth is that we still need to have a semblance of normality. And I think that humans, sorry, I'm getting a bit philosophical here, but are incredible that even in the worst possible situation, we keep being human, and we also find comfort in what is a habit or what we're accustomed to, and things like that, because that actually acts as something comforting, or something that gives us like something to attach ourselves to, you know. So the fact that your favorite type of content that has been produced by either a brand or that your magazine hasn't stopped being published. I mean, I'm a massive comic geek. I cannot tell you how bummed it is that like I am that I haven't, that comics have been stopped printing for the last two months, basically. You know, sounds like, but it's true. It's thank God Marvel Comics is coming back for the 4th of May. Like that's a massive relief.
I wonder, Stefano, what will happen, you know, if COVID goes in the waves that they think it will go in. You know, it's kind of not exactly crisis, panic, emergency that we've just been through, but it is a kind of different state, isn't it? I don't know how you think
Yeah, it's like living in seismic areas, right? I think that's kind of a comparable thing. It's like you just accept this as part of what can happen, and you have a protocol in mind that is like, okay, this is the way in which we react when there is this. I mean, I'm not wishing for it to become a habit of sorts, but I think that there is an element there of you know, you find a way to fit it within your day by day, and as it goes in ways, I think that what we'll have is like different sort of standard or gears of doing comms. You know, there is, oh, here we are, home again, okay, we switch to all digital. And then, because there is this very strong rebound effect, and I'm sure that the second that it's safe to be out again, people will love to go to restaurants or to attend events and whatnot. So there will be a strong rebound. The point is, how do you make sure that you're appropriate for the right moment, right?
So you better save up your comics for when
you're
Yes, exactly. All right, I've got one last question, just to tie it off. Maybe more for Joe. How do you empower your staff to be able to react?
Good question. So I guess there has to be the trust there. You know, a lot of what we've seen with the remote working is, you know, it's forced the empowerment issue because there isn't the time or the space to have all those meetings and kind of push it back up the line. So people have had to be empowered to make decisions, to run with things, to get on with it. And I've seen that, you know, most managers, I would say, definitely many managers, are not really comfortable with it. I think they were used to, you know, that control element. And so I'm hoping that this is a real shift towards actually greater empowerment down the line. It was a backlash from the financial crisis, actually, that we saw, that, you know, everything got pushed back up the line again. That kind of, all the approval processes, everything was going up. You know, prior to that, I felt like people were relatively empowered, whereas that kind of drew a line and it moved back. So so on the how to do it, I think it depends what kind of business you are, but building that trust, equipping managers with sort of situational leadership styles. You know, how do they coach people? How do they get comfortable themselves that this other person can get on with the job that they need to do and they don't need micromanaging? There are lots of leadership tips that I'm happy to share after as well, programs and stuff. So but yeah, it's really that building the trust, you know, to let them do that, and giving them permission. You know, one of the things we see is when we try and shift a culture to more accountability and ownership, is that if the culture's not been that way before, then people are reluctant. They want to take it on, but they're kind of reluctant because they've never been allowed. It's like a kid that was never allowed to eat the cookies before, right? And now you're like, hey, fill your boots, you can have as many cookies as you like, right? Go for it. And they kind of don't want to put their hand in the jar. And it's a little bit the same. It's kind of, one, you have to equip the people to want to take that ownership, you know, to be empowered, and you have to equip the managers to allow it to happen.
It's funny that you mentioned that, Joe, because we have a lot of every now and then, we will hire a new project manager or something like that would come from maybe an agency of a different size or that at a different management style. Yeah. And I distinctly remember a couple of conversations where I had some producers say, "Oh, I don't dare give my opinion about something if I think it's wrong, because otherwise, I get severely, told off." And I was like, one thing is being responsible, but one thing is just silencing people. I think that everybody is entitled to an opinion, and then the person that is responsible for that decides whether to take that on board or not. But shushing people, and I think that's like a gigantic problem for difficult questions. And being prepared for difficult questions, I think, is what the new managers or the managers of the companies that will be successful will be sort of judged against, rather than passing the blame to somebody else or upstairs,
Yeah. But that's the thing, you need to say to you need to say to someone like that, "Look, I've hired you for your opinions. That's what I want from you. You have permission. It's okay."
Fair enough.
Oh, all right. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you. That was super, super informative, I know, for me, and hopefully for the attendees. I'm just going to share my screen quickly one more time, just to let everybody know that. Just right here. So we do offer out to everyone who attends our events, we do offer free strategy workshops. So if you are looking to develop a strategy for your reactive comms, we are offering those out to anyone who attended. So you can just get in touch with us through our website, or you have my email address from the email from earlier today, and we can set that up with you, or just spend some time together discussing your goals and what that looks like for you and your brand. And our next event is about internal comms, and if they look the same in every sector, and that's coming up the end of next month. And so we will be sending out a link to grab a ticket to that if you are interested in the next event. But thank you again to our speakers and to everyone who attended. And it's been great.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your day.